There's a particular experience that keeps coming up when people talk about change, though they rarely describe it directly. It's not failure, it's not doubt, it's more subtle than that. It's the feeling of standing at the edge of something you genuinely want and discover that wanting isn't the same as entering. It's the sense that some versions of yourself don't feel ahead of you, they feel unavailable, as if they exist in the same room, but behind glass. You can see them, you can imagine living from that place, and yet when you try to move forward, something inside resists. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to stop momentum. The body calls it, not now, even when the mind calls it, finally. You may notice how quickly the mind wants to explain that resistance. It reaches for familiar language, fear, blocks, limiting beliefs, but none of those quite fit. The feeling isn't panic, it isn't negativity. It's closer to a weight, a heaviness that pulls you back into the shape you already know. Almost like your identity has a home address and it keeps forwarding your mail back to the old place. What's interesting is that this weight doesn't feel hostile, it feels loyal, like something that stayed with you for a long time and isn't sure it's allowed to leave yet. If you're seasoned, you may notice how calm that loyalty can be. No drama, no dark night, just a steady preference for the familiar.
Mhm. Yes, and what often goes unnoticed is that this sense of unreachability doesn't come with any kind of fireworks. It doesn't announce itself as a problem. It's very quiet, almost polite. It shows up as a subtle flattening, a gentle draining. You sit down to step into the new version of you, and suddenly you want to reorganize your sock drawer instead. People will say things like, I know what I want, or I can see where I'm heading, and yet there's no traction. Not because they're lazy or conflicted, but because the version of themselves they're imagining doesn't quite feel like theirs. It feels like a stranger wearing their clothes. A convincing stranger, but still a stranger. There's a difference between wanting a future and recognizing yourself in it. And recognition isn't logical, it's actually something embodied. It's nervous system level familiarity. You may notice how the body accepts some futures immediately, even if they're not particularly joyful, simply because they're consistent with the current pattern. So when someone says, I just can't seem to get there, what they're often describing isn't distance in time, it's distance in identity. The future self doesn't match the emotional climate they've been living in, and the system quietly rejects what it can't place. It's not a punishment, it's categorization. This doesn't belong to us, like returning an item to the wrong shelf.
We tend to think of time as movement, past behind us, future ahead. But lived experience doesn't work that cleanly. We don't simply pass through time, we carry pieces of ourselves with us. And some of those pieces are heavier than others. Some of them have names. Others are just tones you return to without noticing. Certain identities form around moments that mattered, periods where something was survived, endured, managed. Those identities don't dissolve when circumstances change, they linger. They linger because they once served a purpose, and if they served a purpose, they start to feel like proof, proof that you were capable, proof that you adapted, proof that you earned your place in your own life. You might notice how easy it is to access versions of yourself built from effort, vigilance, competence. Those selves feel close, even when exhausting. They come with a script, hold it together, keep going. But the versions of yourself that feel unreachable are often quieter, less defended, less justified. They don't come with a clear explanation for why they're allowed to exist. And that's precisely what makes them feel suspect. It's curious, isn't it? how a peaceful self can feel more dangerous than a stressed one, simply because stress has a story and peace sometimes doesn't.
Hmm. There's something almost tender about that suspicion. It's not that the system is trying to keep you small, it's trying to keep you coherent. Coherence is how the nervous system predicts. Prediction is how it feels safe. So if a future version of you is too different, it isn't greeted with celebration, it's greeted with scanning. If your sense of self has been organized around being needed, being strong, being the one who holds things together, then a future version of you that doesn't rely on those traits can feel destabilizing, even threatening. Not because it's a bad thing, but because it changes the terms of your belonging. It changes what you think you have to do to be included. You may notice this when imagining a calmer life, or a slower one, or one where you're no longer braced for impact. Instead of relief, there's discomfort, a sense of something essential would be lost. And often, what feels essential is not the suffering, but actually the structure. What's often being protected there isn't pain, but it's meaning. The meaning that came from surviving, from enduring, from managing complexity. And letting go can feel that meaning can feel like erasing proof of what you went through mattered. People don't only cling to the past because it hurts, they cling because it contains a kind of moral accounting. I paid, therefore I am allowed. A future that doesn't require payment can feel like cheating.
There's an unspoken agreement many people carry. Whatever comes next should make sense given what came before. Continuity feels responsible. It feels adult. It feels like the right way to change. You don't want to seem inconsistent. You don't want to seem naive. You don't want to look like someone who fell for an illusion. But continuity also has limits. It limits what feels permissible. It quietly defines what kind of life is allowed to follow the one that you already lived. Some futures feel unreachable because they don't honor the narrative. They don't explain themselves properly. They don't show they're working. They don't prove they were earned. And if you've lived a life where worth had to be demonstrated through effort, through contribution, through endurance, a future that arrives without credentials can feel almost offensive, as if it skipped a step that you were told was mandatory. And you may notice that some part of you prefers a hard earned miracle to an unearned ease because it doesn't embarrass the old story. It's curious how people will say they want freedom and then insist on a storyline that keeps them bound, not out of stupidity, out of loyalty to coherence.
This is where desire can actually make things worse. Wanting a different version of yourself can increase the sense of separation because it quietly reinforces the idea that you are not that yet. There's a subtle hierarchy created. The present self becomes something to outgrow, tolerate, or fix, and the future self becomes a prize held at a distance. But belonging doesn't work that way. You don't step into a new identity by aspiring to it. You step into it when it feels familiar enough not to trigger defense. That's when it can also be odd to want a future and feel yourself recoil from it at the same time. Desire pulls you forward, belonging decides whether you stay there. Desire often comes with narration. When I finally become X, which can quietly postpone, admiring the future like a distant skyline. That's why some very desirable futures remain inaccessible, while less desirable ones feel almost inevitable. They fit the emotional pattern, they extend the story rather than interrupt it. And in a strange way, the system trusts a familiar disappointment more than an unfamiliar peace.
There's a small ordinary moment that comes to mind here. There's a cafe I pass most afternoons, and more often than not, there's a man sitting by the window. No phone, no laptop, just a drink slowly warming in his hands. His attention resting nowhere in particular. He doesn't look especially happy. He doesn't look bored either. He looks unoccupied. The kind of unoccupied that isn't performative. Not, I'm resting so I can be productive later. Just unoccupied, as if his existence doesn't need a reason to be legitimate. The first few times I noticed him, my mind rushed to contextualize him, waiting for someone, taking a break, avoiding something. Eventually, it occurred to me that this might simply be how he exists in that moment. And what surprised me wasn't admiration, it was discomfort. That version of a person unoccupied, unguarded, not obviously producing anything, felt strangely inaccessible. Not impossible, just unsupported by explanation. It was as if my mind wanted a justification. What are you doing here? And it made me wonder how many future selves feel unreachable simply because they don't have an argument attached to them.
That is such a precise observation because the discomfort doesn't come from what he's doing, it comes from what he isn't doing. He isn't justifying his presence, he isn't performing rest in order to recover from full productivity. He isn't narrating the pause. He isn't proving he deserves the chair. That's often what makes certain versions of ourselves feel unreachable. They don't come with any instructions. They don't slot neatly into the identity economy we've been running. If you've learned quietly over time that existence needs a reason, then a self that exists without explanation can feel illicit. Like you're getting away with something, like you've broken a rule you can't quite name. You may notice how quickly the mind tries to turn that kind of being into a project. I should learn to relax. Even spaciousness can become another form of proving. Sometimes the unreachable version of you isn't the ambitious one, it's the one who stops arguing for their own legitimacy. The one who can sit by the window and let the drink go cold without turning it into a statement.
When people talk about blocks, it's often assumed something needs to be removed. But sometimes what's being experienced isn't blockage, it's a boundary that protects coherence, that says if you cross too quickly, something inside will fragment. This doesn't mean the future self isn't aligned. It means the transition isn't transactional. It can't be forced through effort or strategy. You may notice this when change starts to feel close, not exciting, but disorienting, as if stepping into that version of yourself would require letting go of a private contract that you've lived by for years. Contracts like strain equals worth, effort equals legitimacy, being needed equals being safe, or even if I stop managing everything, I will become irrelevant. These contracts rarely appear as sentences, they appear as sensations: tightening, restlessness, the urge to check, fix, or clarify. These contracts don't dissolve through willpower, they loosen through recognition. And recognition often arrives not as a thunderbolt, but as a quiet embarrassment. Oh, I've been paying for this with my life. When this boundary is present, the mind tries to leap over it with concepts. But the boundary isn't conceptual, it's a relationship with past commitments.
And recognition doesn't arrive on demand. It tends to come sideways through fatigue, through boredom with old explanations, through the quiet realization that you're no longer interested in maintaining a particular identity, even if you don't yet know what replaces it. This is often mistaken for stagnation or loss of motivation. But something else is happening. The system is renegotiating belonging. It's asking, if I stop being who I've been, do I still get to be here? Do I still get to be loved? Do I still get to belong to myself? The unreachable version of you isn't asking to be chased, it's waiting for you to stop insisting that change justify itself, to stop narrating the journey, to stop arguing with the timeline, to stop proving continuity. And you may notice how gentle this can be when it's done well. No dramatic reinventation, no announcement, just small acts of disobedience towards the old identity. A pause you didn't apologize for, a decision you don't over explain, a moment where you let someone misunderstand you without sprinting to fix it. Those are not techniques, they're signals. They tell the system, we are allowed to be different now.
What if access isn't granted through becoming something new, but through standing differently in time, not ahead of yourself, not behind, just less entangled? What if the future that feels unreachable is actually very close, but it exists in an emotional register that you haven't learned how to inhabit without abandoning something familiar? And what if that abandonment feels dangerous, not because you're weak, but because you've been loyal? Loyal to the self that survived, loyal to the story that made sense of things, loyal to the version of you that knew how to function when functioning was required, loyal to the habits that once prevented chaos, even if they now prevent peace. You may notice how hard it is to release a story without feeling like you're erasing the person who lived it. But releasing the story isn't denying the past. It's refusing to let the past keep writing your future in the same handwriting. And sometimes the simplest shift is not believe more, it's stop measuring. Stop standing in the old place with a ruler, calculating how far away you are, as if distance is evidence. Notice how the measuring itself becomes a ritual. You check progress, check signs, check mood. The ritual keeps you busy, and busyness feels safe. Meanwhile, the doorway stays open, unentered, right beside your feet.
That loyalty deserves respect. It doesn't need to be overridden or defeated, but loyalty that has outlived its purpose doesn't dissolve through force. It loosens through gentler meanings, through noticing, through allowing pauses without explanation, through moments where you don't rush to define yourself, through letting the new self feel awkward at first without declaring it not you, through letting unfamiliar calm be unfamiliar without turning it into a crisis. And sometimes, without effort or announcement, you realize that what once felt unreachable no longer feels distant. Not because you crossed a bridge, but because you stopped standing where the distance was being measured at all. You didn't conquer anything, you didn't win against yourself. You simply stopped insisting on continuity as proof of integrity. You let a different integrity emerge, one that doesn't require tension to be real. And if that ending feels too clean, notice that. The real ending is quieter. You catch yourself mid pattern and choose not to continue, not because you must, because you can.
If this conversation stayed with you even a little, you're welcome to keep it close. You can do that by liking the video, subscribing to the channel, sharing it with someone who might recognize themselves here, and tapping the bell if you'd like to be notified when the next inquiry appears. No urgency, no obligation, just an open door if and when you feel like returning. We'll be here. Until next time, think differently, dream boldly, and create consciously.
I'm a quiet rebel. I don't need a shower. Changing the world from the inside out. No fists in the